on the Mount, we're going to be in Matthew chapter 7 today. And guess what? We've made it. We've made it to one of the most quoted, misquoted, mangled, and misunderstood verses in the Bible. Judge not, lest ye be judged. How should we understand this verse and those that are immediately after it? Tonight, as we look at these verses, we must first remember that this passage is but a small portion of a much larger passage that we call the Sermon on the Mount. We have already looked at the first two chapters in the Sermon on the Mount, chapters 5 and 6 of this sermon, and we are now in chapter 7. The things that we learned in chapters 5 and 6 are extremely important as we try to discern what Jesus is trying to communicate to us when he tells us not to judge. Tonight we are going to see that these verses are not an island unto themselves, but fit into a much larger message that Jesus is preaching to his immediate listeners and now to us as we read through the Scriptures. We are entering the climax of the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus has taught us a lot in chapters 5 and 6, and now he is going to start telling us how we need to apply what we have learned. And specifically, tonight we are going to see how we can live as the light of the world and the salt of the earth in the way that we interact with those around us, both within and without the church. So the first thing I want to do before we dig into these verses is I just want to run over the previous, the chapters 5 and 6 of the Sermon on the Mount, just to remind us of the context that we're going to be reading chapter 7, 1 through 5. And the first part of the Sermon on the Mount is the Beatitudes, which I told you before was kind of an introduction to the Sermon on the Mount. It's a bunch of proverbs that Jesus gives to tell people what God's wisdom is versus instead of what man's wisdom is. Man's wisdom tells us to go out and seize the day, to fight for everything we want, to put ourselves first, and that suffering is to be avoided. But God's wisdom tells us to be meek, to love peace, to show mercy and kindness, and that persecution for Christ's sake is good. Man's wisdom says that me first, forget about everyone else. God's wisdom says others first. I don't need to worry as much about my own desires, wants. And after the Beatitudes, Jesus also exhorts us to be strong witnesses for him, to preach the gospel to the world through our words and how we live. We are told that we are the salt of the earth and the light of the world. Then, we see Jesus tell us that the righteousness of the Pharisees is not enough. And this is very important to the context of chapter 7. He shows us that the Pharisees had set a standard of righteousness that they claimed to live up to, and they judged other people by their standards that they claimed to live to. What Jesus does in these verses in chapter 5 is he takes the standards the Pharisees claim to follow, and he shows how they don't actually follow them by kicking it up a notch. And by doing so, he reveals that they did not live up to the standards they held everyone up to. Jesus tells us that hating our brother is just as sinful and evil as murdering him, that lusting after a woman is just as wicked as committing adultery with her. And while there is definitely a difference in the outcome between murder and hate, ultimately in the eyes of God they are both sin, and they both condemn us as unrighteous in his eyes. Inward sin is just as wicked in the eyes of God as outward sin, even if it does not have as large of an impact on the world around us. And in this section of the sermon, Jesus is turning our eyes inward to the sin that dwells within us, even when we live outwardly righteous lives according to the standards of the world or the standards of the Pharisees and hypocrites. And then we see that we are told not to seek men's praise in chapter 6. We're told that we shouldn't do right so that men will praise us. We are called to pray in secret, do our alms in secret, fast in secret, because ultimately we are to be seeking to please God and not men. We're then given the Lord's Prayer, what is often called the Lord's Prayer, as an example prayer to show us how we ought to pray, instead of using the vain repetitions like the heathens do. And in the midst, right after the Lord's Prayer, and actually in the Lord's Prayer, we see this concept, forgive as you have been forgiven. In this example prayer, we see a very important verse. Matthew 6:12 says, forgive us our debts. What's the next part? As we forgive our debtors. It's asking God to treat us the way we treat other people. So that verse is very important in the context of chapter 7. And what is our greatest debt? sin. So we need to be forgiving others of their sin toward us if we want God to forgive us of our sin towards Him. Which is greater, the amount of sin your neighbor has committed directly against you, or the amount of sin you have committed against God? After the example prayer finishes, Jesus then warns us once again in verses 14 and 15 that God will treat us the way we treat others. He will forgive us as we forgive others. That's a very scary warning, isn't it? Do we really want God to treat us the way we treat other people? Do we only want Him to forgive us like we forgive others? Do we really want what we deserve based on how we treat those around us? And then chapter 6 finishes up with Jesus telling us that we need to stop worrying so much about the things of this world and instead focus on the future kingdom of God. We are told not to lay up treasures for ourselves here on earth where moth and rust doth corrupt, but to lay and thieves do break in and steal, but instead we're supposed to lay them up in heaven. We are also reminded that we cannot serve two masters. We cannot both serve our flesh in the world and serve God. Our actions are either serving one or the other. They cannot serve both. And then Jesus gives us two illustrations of the birds and of the flowers, how they don't worry about their life. They just take what God has given them and live life to the fullest. And now we come to the climax of the sermon. So now that we have all of these things in mind, let us look at the first point, the first application that Jesus gives us to the Sermon on the Mount in our lives. Matthew 7, 1 through 5 says, Judge not, lest ye be judged, judge not that ye be not judged. For with what judgment ye meet, or with what judgment ye judge, ye shall be judged. And with what measure ye meet, it shall be measured to you again. And why beholdest thou the mote that is in thy brother's eye, but considerest not the beam that is in thine own eye? Or how wilt thou say to thy brother, Let me pull out the mote out of thine eye, and behold, the beam is in thine own eye? Thou hypocrite, first cast out the beam out of thine own eye, and then thou shalt see it clearly to cast out the mote out of thy brother's eye. And so we see first, judge not, that ye be not judged. So what does the word judge here mean? Because you know what? The word judge has a pretty broad semantical range. There's a lot of different ways that you can interpret or define the word judge, aren't there? And just in the Bible, this word, just even if you just look at the one Greek word in this specific passage, it's used in many different ways in many different contexts. Sometimes judging means to determine what is right and what is wrong. Sometimes it means to come to an opinion about a person or thing, either negative or positive. It's sometimes talking about judging in a court of law, on the guilt or innocence of a person, on the justness or injustice of a law. Sometimes it means to condemn or to sentence. Sometimes it means to vindicate or avenge. And it often can mean to compare two different things. So which one of these definitions of judge are we seeing here in this passage? Well, there's a huge clue right in the first verse. Judge not, that ye be not judged. What does that tell you about the definition of the word judged in this passage? It's probably a negative definition, right? Judging in this passage is a bad thing. So that means a lot of those ideas, a lot of those things that we see like discernment is a type of judgment. Well, that's not what this passage is talking about. Discernment is the ability given to us as Christians by God to tell the difference between good and evil, right and wrong. Well, that's not what this is talking about, is it? It's not talking about vindication. So the fact that we are told not to judge, so that because if we do judge, we ourselves will be judged, it tells us that Jesus is using the word in a negative sense, and it's something we want to avoid. It is not something we want to happen to us. If you are accused of a crime, don't you want to go to court and prove yourself innocent? To be judged, to be free of guilt of that crime? So that can't be what it's talking about. It can't be discernment or talking about the legal process of determining guilt or innocence. It can't be talking about comparing two different things. And it definitely can't be talking about vindicating or avenging someone. Since all of these usages of judge are ones in which we might actually like to happen to us in certain circumstances, they can't be what Jesus means. Since that would make this verse nonsensical, wouldn't it? Because we are being told, don't judge, because if you do, you'll get judged. So that tells us, with one option, to condemn, to pass sentence upon. To declare a person or thing to be reprehensible, wrong, or evil. To look down on someone. To think less of them. This is when we decide, even proclaim, that a person is evil, horrible, reprehensible because of what they have done or said. And it happens all the time. On Facebook, on news programs, in the newspaper, by politicians about politicians. Have you ever seen those Facebook posts that are like, share this picture of this guy because he did all these horrible things? Have you ever stopped and tried to find out if he actually did those horrible things that he's being accused of, or did you just share it? Because isn't that a form of judging right there? You didn't even look for the facts. You just believed automatically. You know, there's people in India who have been killed because someone falsely accused them of a crime. They were killed by a mob because it went crazy on social media because someone accused them of a crime. Everyone started sharing it. The next thing you know, 100,000 people have seen this picture of this guy that supposedly committed a crime that he didn't commit. The mob found him and they killed him. All because of a false allegation. That's the kind of judging we're talking about here in part. We as Christians need to be careful, don't we? And what was the warning that Jesus gave us in Matthew 6:14-15 after he finished the Lord's Prayer? For if ye forgive men their trespasses, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. But if ye forgive not men their trespasses, neither will your Father forgive your trespasses. That sounds a lot like judge not, so that you won't be judged, doesn't it? We're seeing this come up again. God will do to us what we do to others. If we forgive, he will forgive us. If we judge, we will be judged. So then this, of course, begs the question, if we judge, what standard are we going to be judged by? Our own standards. Verse 2 tells us that we will be judged by the standards that we judge others. It says, for with what judgment ye judge, ye shall be judged, and with what measure ye meet, it shall be measured to you again. Because if we judge others, we will then be judged by the same standards we used to judge them. This verse further reinforces the fact that the judging being spoken of in this passage is the negative definition of condemning someone, looking down on them because they do not meet your standard of approval. They do not meet your standards that you think make someone righteous. This type of judging condemnation is often done in a condescending way. When we look down upon another person because they aren't as good as we are. When we despise someone because they don't have the same beliefs as we do. When we treat people poorly just because they aren't like us. You know, there's a lot of wickedness in this world. But what are we as Christians, how are we as Christians called to respond? In love. With mercy, compassion, grace. All the ways that God responded to our sin and our wickedness in our hearts. A lot of times it is easy to look at ourselves in comparison to other people and think we are in much better shape than they are. We're smarter, we're more moral, more righteous, we're nicer, we're better looking, we're friendlier. But the truth is, we're often willing to cherry coat our own failings, aren't we? We have excuses. Well, yeah, I lost my temper, but, you know, I had a hard day. Yeah, I wasn't the best person, but, you know, all this other stuff happened. Are you giving other people those same excuses when you judge them for how they treated you? Are you thinking, I wonder if they just had a really bad day? I better be nice to them. They might need it. Or are you, I can't believe he'd say something like that. How could he hates me. Just to, how are we looking at what they do to us? Are we giving them the same grace and excuses that we give ourselves? Or are we judging them more harshly than we judge ourselves? We always assume the worst in people we don't like, don't we? It's easy to do. We don't like someone, so we always assume that they must have the most evil, wicked, horrible reasons for doing that thing that we didn't like. And the truth is, a lot of times they don't even realize they did something you didn't like. We don't cut them any slack and instead get upset over every little slight because, of course, they meant to do that. But if we are to take a hard look at ourselves, who we truly are, and judge ourselves by the standards that we judge those around us by, and do it honestly, I think we find that we fail a lot more than we're willing to admit. And we begin to realize how much sin is still in and within us. So we've seen, judge not, that ye be not judged, for with what judgment ye judge, it shall be judged unto you. And then we're told in verses 3 to 5, it says, and why beholdest, or verses 3 to 5, why beholdest thou the mote that is in thy brother's eye, but considerest not the beam that is in thine own eye? Or how wilt thou say to thy brother, let me pull out the mote out of thine eye, and behold, a beam is in thine own eye? Thou hypocrite, first cast out the beam out of thine own eye, and then thou shalt see clearly to cast out the mote out of thy brother's eye. We're told in these verses, worry about yourself first. Take care of your sin before you start worrying about other people's sin. And it starts with an illustration, a very ridiculous illustration. He says, why are you worried about the mote? What is a mote? A mote is a tiny speck of dust. And your brother has a speck of dust in his eye. And you're really worried about that. You really want to help him get that speck of dust out of his eye. Now, specks of dust in your eye are really annoying and painful, aren't they? And you want to get them out. He says, your brother's got a little speck of dust in your eye, and you're worried about helping him, but you've got this gigantic beam sticking out of your eye. And it's not just talking about a 2x4, it's talking about like the beams that hold up our ceiling. This huge beam is sticking out of your eye, and you're trying to help your friend get a little speck of dust out of his eye. How do you think that's going to go? Are you going to be able to see to get that speck out of his eye? No. In fact, most likely you're going to hurt him. Could you imagine this gigantic beam out of someone's eye and they're moving around? Wham! Hits that guy, knocks him out. Wham! Hits another guy, knocks him out. You're going to do a whole lot of damage if you don't get that log out of your own eye first, aren't you? Trying to fix other people's problems when you've got problems of your own can do a lot of damage. And we're told, get that beam out of your own eye first, so you can then help your brother. It's not that we shouldn't try to help our brother, but we need to take care of ourselves first. And by that I mean we need to take care of the wrong and the sin that is in our heart and get right with God before we try to help other people get right with God. You know, the sin in my life that is in my heart has a much greater impact on me than the sin in your life. Wouldn't you say that's true? I mean, yes, everybody's sin affects other people, but the sin in my own life affects me more. And so if I'm not taking care of the sin in my life, because I'm too worried about the sin in your life, I'm worrying about the wrong things. The closer something is to you, the larger it appears in your vision. You know, a 10 by 10 foot piece of wood doesn't obstruct your vision very much when it's 200 yards away. But when it's only 2 feet away, it completely blocks your view. And when you've got unconfessed, unrepented, undealt with sin in your own life, that sin is going to obstruct your view and make it so that you cannot help other people with their sin. And in fact, most of the time what's going to end up happening is you're going to end up making things worse for them. You're going to end up making it harder for them, and perhaps even damaging them and injuring them, because you're so focused on fixing them that you aren't focused on the problems that you have in your own life that you need to take care of. He says, "Thou hypocrite, first cast out the beam out of thine own eye, and then thou shalt see clearly to cast out the mote out of their brother's eye." Let me ask you something. Does anything get you more riled up than when someone's being hypocritical towards you? That's pretty annoying and infuriating, isn't it? When you're at work and the laziest guy at work is telling you, "Man, you're lazy." You're like, "I don't work." That really hurt. That really upsets you, doesn't it? Well, how do you think people in the world feel when we start condemning them, judging them, but we aren't dealing with the obvious sin in our life? Do you think it makes them want to listen? Or do you think it makes them want to turn away from God? Not listen to anything we have to say? If you have a friend who has a serious problem with anger management, you aren't going to listen to that person when he tells you you need to stop getting so angry, are you? Well, who are you to tell me? We can't help other people deal with the sin in their lives if we aren't even willing to take a close, careful, and brutally honest look at ourselves and deal with the sin that we find in our hearts. We need to spend far more time worrying about the sin in our own lives than worrying about what the world is doing or what other people are doing. If we are becoming more sanctified as we deal with the sin that God shows us in our lives, we're, number one, not going to have much time to worry about what other people are doing. But number two, we're not going to have to find people to help because God will bring them to us. If God is truly sanctifying, if we are allowing God to help us purge certain sins out of our lives, then God will bring people into our lives that we will be able to help. We aren't going to have to go looking for them. But we need to focus on the sin in our own hearts, in our own lives, and take care of that. Get that taken care of. And if we want to be able to minister to sinners, we need to be able to do so in a humble manner, knowing that we're just like they are. We're saved by grace, and Christ has offered that same grace to them. As Christians, we often get Matthew 7:1 thrown in our faces. And sadly, I think there are many times that we deserve it. God is not telling us not to have discernment about what is right or wrong in this passage. He isn't telling us we can't call out certain things as sinful. But we are not being told to ignore sin and pretend it doesn't exist. But we are being called to stop condemning other people around us. Stop judging them by the standards that we ourselves are not even keeping. When we see a brother fall in the sin of adultery, we shouldn't rub it in their face every time we see them. Because if we really look hard at ourselves, we would realize that we have lusted in our hearts many times and therefore are just as guilty as they are. We shouldn't look down on the people that don't live like we do. We should instead show them the love of God and have compassion on them because they are sinners just like we are. And if we want God to show us love, compassion, and forgiveness, that is how we should be treating other people. If we as Christians spent most of our time worrying about the sin that is in our own lives and focused on fixing our own problems, we would accomplish far more for Christ than we do when we run around condemning everyone we see for all the ways in which we think they have failed. I want you to leave today with one question. Do you honestly want God to judge you by the standards that you are judging everyone else by? If your answer is no, then you need to work on not judging. I know I need to stop and work on it. It's hard. It's really easy to judge other people, isn't it? It's a part of our human nature. But if we want God, if we want to be able to approach God and say, God, please forgive me for this sin, then we need to be willing to forgive other people. Do you really live up to the standards that you judge others by, or do you just pretend that you do and make excuses for the times that you fall? We need to show everyone around us the same love, compassion, compassion and mercy that we have been shown by Jesus Christ. We need to treat them the way we want God to treat us, and by doing so, perhaps they will be drawn towards Christ, of whom we are but a pale reflection. Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you.